Ella had always been captivated by the quiet, by places untouched by time. When the opportunity arose to teach at a small school in the remote village of Maple Hollow, she was eager to escape the noise of city life. She arrived with little knowledge of the village's dark past, seeing only its picturesque charm, a sleepy town surrounded by dense woods, with an old cemetery on the hill and an abandoned chapel nearby. From the moment she arrived, the villagers greeted her with polite smiles, but there was something in their eyes that unsettled her. They were careful in their words, as if holding back something important. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. "Stay away from the cemetery at night," a local farmer named Tom warned her one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's things there you don't want to see." Tom's warning was vague, and Ella, being new to the area, shrugged it off as nothing more than an old superstition. But that night, as she lay in her small cottage, a chill crept across her skin. The wind howled through the trees, and for reasons she couldn't explain, the cemetery on the hill called to her. She brushed the thought aside and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. Ella's first nightmare was vivid, too real to be just a bad dream. She stood at the edge of the cemetery, the headstones rising like ancient sentinels in the mist. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows, and there, just beyond the cemetery gates, stood an old woman. Her skin was pale, her face gaunt, twisted with sorrow and rage. Her eyes were empty, and her mouth opened to speak. "The past never lets go," the old woman whispered, her voice sharp and cold, as though the words had been buried for years. Ella woke with a start, her heart racing. The room was cold, despite the warmth of the fire burning in the hearth. The woman's image lingered in her mind, haunting her in the darkness of the night. The dreams didn't stop. They grew stronger, more frequent, as if the woman was trying to tell her something. The next night the woman appeared again, standing at the cemetery's gates, her mouth moving in a way that sent shivers down Ella's spine. "The past never lets go." Over and over, those words echoed in her mind. As the days passed, strange things began to happen. Items in her cottage were moved when she wasn't looking, a book would be found on the floor, and sometimes the air around her would feel inexplicably cold. The whispers she heard from the villagers seemed to take on new meaning. One evening, after dinner, Tom came to visit. He was a rugged man with kind eyes, but there was always a sense of unease about him, especially when he spoke of the cemetery. "You're having the dreams too, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low. Ella blinked. "It's the old woman," he interrupted. "Mrs. Harper. She's the one who haunts the cemetery. She's been doing it for years." "Mrs. Harper?" Ella asked, her curiosity piqued. Tom nodded. "She was a part of this village long ago. A kind woman, they say, until the tragedy. Her child died, and after that she changed. She became consumed with grief and anger. Some say she made a pact with something dark, hoping to bring her child back. But instead, she lost her soul." Ella fruncio el ceño. "So she's a ghost?" "More than that," Tom said. "She's a curse. Every generation, she chooses one soul from this village to replace hers, to free her from her torment. And it's your turn, Ella. The ghost is marking you." Ella felt a chill crawl down her spine. She had no idea why the ghost had chosen her, but Tom's words felt too real to ignore. She had to know more. The next day, Ella visited the cemetery alone. It was a bright, crisp afternoon, and the graveyard seemed peaceful in the daylight. The chapel, however, was abandoned, its stone walls cracked and overgrown with ivy. She walked inside, the air stale with dust and neglect. In the back corner, half buried beneath fallen beams, she found a weathered journal. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages within were yellowed with age. It was Mrs. Harper's journal. The entries began innocently enough, recounting a happy life with a young daughter and a loving husband. But as the days passed, the tone shifted. Mrs. Harper's words became darker, filled with sorrow and desperation after her child's sudden death. She wrote about her attempts to communicate with her daughter's spirit, seeking any means to bring her back. Then one night, the final entry appeared. "I've made a pact. I will bring her back, no matter the cost, but I fear it may cost me my soul." Ella's blood ran cold. Mrs. Harper had indeed made a pact, one that had bound her soul to the cemetery. And now, that soul was trying to drag others into her nightmare. Ella's mind raced. How could she break the curse? She needed answers. And the village elder, Mrs. Abbott, was the only one who might know. That evening, Ella visited Mrs. Abbott, an ancient woman who lived on the outskirts of the village. Mrs. Abbott's cottage was full of old books and artifacts, the air thick with the scent of herbs and incense. "You've been marked, haven't you?" Mrs. Abbott asked without preamble, her sharp eyes seeing more than Ella could hide. Ella nodded, her throat dry. "I've been having these dreams of Mrs. Harper. I don't understand." "Why me?" Mrs. Abbott sighed. "Every generation, one soul is chosen. A new victim to take Mrs. Harper's place. But there's a way to break the curse, though it's not easy. You must confront the spirit at the cemetery under the full moon and show her the love and forgiveness she lost long ago. Only then can she be freed." Ella felt a surge of determination. She had no choice now but to face the ghost, no matter how terrifying the thought. The night of the full moon arrived, and with Tom and Mrs. Abbott by her side, Ella made her way to the cemetery. The air was thick with tension as they approached the graveyard, the moonlight casting long shadows over the gravestones. As they walked deeper into the cemetery, Ella could feel the temperature dropping. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and a sense of dread settled in her chest. It felt as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then, as they reached the chapel, the wind howled louder, and the graveyard seemed to come alive with a dark energy. From the mist, the figure of the old woman appeared, her pale, skeletal hands clawing at the air, her eyes hollow with madness. "You cannot escape," she hissed, her voice a twisted, cold whisper, as if the wind itself carried her voice. Her presence sent a chill deep into Ella's bones. Ella stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I know your pain, Mrs. Harper," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I understand your grief, your loss, but revenge will never bring you peace. You've lost your soul, but you don't have to keep losing others." The ghost's form flickered, her once formidable presence flickering with uncertainty. Her eyes shifted to Ella's face, and for the first time, something like recognition crossed her twisted features. "I forgive you," Ella continued. "You've been bound by your anger, but you can be free. Let go of the grief, the hatred. Let your soul rest." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, with a horrible, guttural shriek, Mrs. Harper's form flickered violently, her body trembling as though it were coming apart. Her eyes locked with Ella's, and for a fleeting second, Ella could see the woman that had once been vulnerable, filled with an overwhelming sorrow. With a final, anguished cry, Mrs. Harper's ghost let out a wail of despair, her body collapsing into nothingness. The cold wind vanished, and the air grew still. The oppressive weight that had loomed over the cemetery for so long lifted, leaving behind only silence. Ella, Tom, and Mrs. Abbott stood in stunned silence, staring at the spot where Mrs. Harper's ghost had been. The moon now hung high in the sky, bright and clear. The cemetery, once cursed, was now just a graveyard. The strange occurrences around the village stopped. The whispers faded, and the village returned to its quiet, peaceful rhythm. The nightmares ceased, and for the first time since she arrived in Maple Hollow, Ella felt a sense of calm. Ella decided to stay in Maple Hollow. She had come to the village seeking solitude, but now she understood that some histories were meant to be healed, not forgotten. The past, she realized, would always echo in the present, but it was up to the living to find the peace the dead could never reach. Years passed, and the village continued to thrive. The cemetery, once the source of endless fear, became just another part of the village's history. No one spoke of Mrs. Harper anymore, and the curse was forgotten. But Ella knew the truth, that sometimes the darkest shadows came from a place of deep sorrow, and it was only by offering forgiveness that one could break free. The ghost of Mrs. Harper never returned. The cemetery remained a quiet place, but now it was just a cemetery, a resting place for those who could finally sleep. Are you ready to face the ghosts in your life? To confront the shadows that have held you captive? Like this story if it sent shivers down your spine. Comment below and share your thoughts. What would you do if you were marked by a restless spirit? Subscribe for more tales of mystery, horror, and the supernatural.